All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Friday, November 1st. We are just days away from the election. Well, from the official voting day. I'm actually making a plan as we speak to try and get my vote in early, but you got me out here. What are we doing this week?
Yeah, I want to fit in one more episode before the election, and it's about the economy. Ricky, we started this election year by going through. Our plan was to do one episode a month on issues that are going to impact this election. So we did abortion and immigration and crime and taxes, right? We did all spending. We did all of those at the beginning. Then it kind of got upended when President Biden dropped out and Vice President Harris became the nominee. But ultimately, we always knew that the issue that we wanted to end on before the election was the economy. And as James Carville famously said back in 1992 on Bill Clinton's campaign, it's the economy, stupid. And all of these other issues, Ricky, that we talked about and that we've said, like it could make a difference on the margins, of course, abortion and immigration and crime and whatever. For the vast majority of voters, as they go into the polls, whether they've already voted or they're going to vote this weekend or vote on Tuesday, the economy is going to be the number one issue on their minds. And in that vein, we are going to welcome on Alana Semuels, who is a writer for Time, to talk about the state of the economy in general and in the swing states in particular. She just came out with a piece last week analyzing the economy in each of the seven battleground states. So she really is a perfect person to talk about for this and give us kind of one final perspective as we head into Tuesday.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I think as you've often pointed out, economy is always seems to be number one on voters' minds. What exactly they're voting for relative to the economy, I'm not entirely sure, but it would be. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, before we bring Alana on, a reminder the podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. They've been building handcrafted, high-end custom tables and desks in Boston since 2018. That's Cannon with two N's. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. Ricky, in the spirit of an economy episode, why did the tree go out and get a new job?
I don't know, Brendan.
I felt like you might have got this one. It wanted to branch out.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, no, I've gotten lost on a handful of your puns lately, so I feel like my gears don't turn like they should.
Fair enough. We'll try to develop some more gettable ones in the near future. All right, let's bring on Alana. All right, we are now really excited to welcome Alana Semuels onto the program. Alana is an economic correspondent for Time. She covers work, consumer spending, retail, gender, and technology. She's a four-time finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism and has won awards from the Society of Business Editors and Writers and the Los Angeles Press Club. We feel extremely grateful that she's joining us right before this election to talk about the state of the economy, particularly in swing states. So, Alana, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so the reason we wanted to have Alana on is because she just wrote this article for Time analyzing the economy in the swing states. And Alana, one of the things that you cite is a recent Gallup poll about, kind of polling what are the most important issues for voters. And as is usual, the economy was issue number one in terms of voters saying that it is extremely important or very important to them. One thing that I found interesting from that poll was that this is the highest percentage. So it was 52% of people said it was either extremely or very important to them. This is the highest percentage since 2008, obviously in the middle of the Great Recession. So just curious if you have any thoughts about why the economy seems to be even more important this cycle than it has the past 3 or 4 cycles.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been through such a tough time with the economy during the pandemic. Um, maybe the election in 2020, but the pandemic was still kind of going on then, so it felt like everything was paused. But we've been through so much, and for some people, it kind of feels like we haven't recovered enough. And so I think that plus just the runaway inflation of the last couple of years has really put this on people's minds. And you hear a lot of economists saying, "Oh, things are better than they were in 2019," but for a lot of people, it doesn't feel that way.
Well, that's a perfect place. Is this is what you're looking at is all of the major data, and you talk about this in your article, seems to say from like a macro perspective, the economy is in like a really good spot. We have, the stock market's at all-time highs. Unemployment is relatively low. Inflation is finally cooling after all of these years. And yet, as you just pointed out, people have a really pessimistic view of the economy. How do we reconcile those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to say the economy and look at the unemployment rate and really just think it applies to all people. But there are a couple things that I think make it harder for some people. Like for instance, if you're trying to buy a house right now, it doesn't really matter how much money you're making. I mean, it matters, but it's not that important how much money you're making because it's going to be really hard to find a house and it's going to feel like it's out of your budget with higher interest rates and mortgage rates and just the low inventory. If you have to pay for childcare right now, it's not going to feel very good just because childcare is really expensive and it's really hard to find good childcare. So I think for certain groups of people, even if you are making more money during the pandemic, you're maybe feeling kind of crappy about it because costs of some things are so much higher. And that includes groceries and just kind of things that you have to buy in your everyday life.
Yeah, so let's talk about housing for a minute. You wrote an article a little while ago for The Atlantic, and you talk about like Wall Street investment in the housing market in general. And something that I found interesting about this campaign is both Harris and JD Vance in particular, in terms of like the Trump campaign, have kind of zeroed in on like this Wall Street investment as a huge problem in terms of like driving up housing costs and making them unaffordable for the regular people that just want to own a home for their families. Can you explain a little bit more about like what you found in investigating like Wall Street investment in the housing market?
Yeah, I mean, you do see investors since really the Great Recession, you've seen investors buying up a lot of houses because back then they were so cheap. I think the pace has really slowed um, because houses are so much more expensive now, but they have over time bought up a lot of houses. And in a time where there's not very much inventory. Both because investors have bought up a lot of houses and also because boomers are staying put, in their houses. Um, you can definitely point to that as a factor. I wouldn't say it's a big factor in driving housing prices up, but you do see, especially in areas like Atlanta, for instance, which is where I wrote my story from, you see whole neighborhoods where investors have bought up lots and lots of single family homes. And so that's making a lot of people have to rent for longer than they might have if those homes were on the market.
Yeah, I feel like the corporate greed is now it's always in some sense been like an easy boogeyman for people. Traditionally on the Democratic side, but increasingly now on the Republican side with how the Republican Party has changed under Trump. But as you just pointed out, it's a small issue in the overall housing crisis that we have in the United States. So, in your reporting and investigating, what are some of the other issues? Because I think this is really important, is when we talk about the economy as a whole, a huge part of it is this feeling of like, I can't buy a house, and housing not only symbolizes the American dream, but in many ways is the American dream in terms of like upward mobility in society. So, just curious, like, what are some of the other issues? Like, if people are angry about that, but what are the causes? How do we try to solve something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was just some data the other day that showed that home sales this year were going to be at the lowest pace for a really long time. I can't remember exactly how long. But you just see not a lot of homes available, and that's why it's so expensive. It's kind of a supply and demand thing. There are a lot of people that want houses, and there aren't that many available. If you look at why that is, a lot of it is because of the super low interest rates that were after the Great Recession and during the pandemic. you could really buy a home for very, your mortgage rate would be extremely low. And now people are looking at it and saying, if I move, I'm going to have what, a 6% mortgage rate, and I had like a 2.55 or something. It costs them so much more to move that it really doesn't make it worth it. You have that, and then you have the boomers staying put. And then you have all these places in the country where we could be building more housing. And, NIMBYism or local rules and regulations has made it really hard to build new housing. So all these things are coming together to make it so there's not enough inventory. And you still have, every year you have people graduating from college and you have people getting married and people who want to buy houses. So it's kind of, think of like a factory and all the cans are piling up and there's nowhere to put them.
I think you're hitting on something that I've been thinking a little bit about is sort of really important in terms of people's perception of the economy being tied now more than ever towards can I afford something like a home? I guess with that in mind, our obviously it feels like our traditional metrics for measuring the economy are not tied to people's perception of it. Are there other things that you're kind of looking at? I think you mentioned one of them in terms of just average like volume of home sales, but are there sort of other places that you're looking to kind of gauge, you know, what would need to change for people to sort of feel better about the economy?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at average weekly earnings or average hourly earnings and then compare them to inflation. So if you look, I think in most, I was looking at this for my story, looking at the swing states, and a lot of the swing states, the average weekly wages have grown faster than inflation. But I think then you have to divide it by income groups. So, we know that income for kind of the lower tier has grown faster than income from the higher tier. So maybe you have these people in the middle or people on the upper end who are saying, well, I'm not doing a whole lot better than I was, in 2019. So I think wages are a really interesting thing to look at. Um, you know, I I think just kind of health insurance and how much, whether people can afford health insurance, whether they get it with their job, and if they're getting a good plan is another thing that's interesting. I was working on a story about just how employer sponsored health insurance plans, the costs have really gone up. So even if you're lucky enough to get health insurance for your job, you're going to be paying more for it and getting less. And so I think things like that, people are paying more and getting less for a lot of different things, and that makes them feel squeezed.
Yeah, this like the idea of the shrinkflation. Yeah,
Yeah, it's not just things on the shelf, it's things like healthcare too.
yeah. I think one of the other areas that I feel like you've written extensively about is the kind of gig economy and the gig workers that are obviously in many areas getting relatively high per hour wages, but there are kind of some drawbacks to I guess how those opportunities are structured. I wonder if you could t talk a little bit about that. I think you wrote a wonderful article about Bernardino and how their unemployment rate dropped from like 15% down to 5%, but there were like some pretty big catches around that.
Yeah, I think, the unemployment rate at maybe a year ago was low enough that people could probably find things that weren't gig economy things to do. But now that it's ticking back up again, I think a lot of people are finding the gig economy is their best bet. And it looks appealing, right? You could be making 20 or more dollars an hour. But then you don't talk about the expenses. You don't talk about the wear on your car. You don't talk about, what happens if you get in an accident or what happens if something happens to your car if you're, say, driving for Uber or driving for Lyft. I did a day driving for Amazon Flex, which is their old delivery service. I don't know if they even still have it anymore. But, I thought it was going to be this leisurely day, kind of strolling through the suburbs, and it was just extremely stressful. There's nowhere to park. I almost got a parking ticket. It was kind of trekking up and down all these stairs. And so I think for a lot of people, they feel like the gig economy is the only thing they can do. And then it turns out to be not what they thought it was going to be. And I think it's another thing that's causing disappointment is people say, "Hey, this isn't what I was promised. This is a worse situation than I thought," and it's disappointing.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, another article that you wrote is about like tip workers. And you were saying how even if wages have crept up in other sections of the economy, minimum wage for waitresses and other tip workers hasn't budged since 91. And in fact, it's at the federal level is $2.13 per hour, which still exists in 17 states. Obviously, states can set their own minimum wages for tip workers. One thing here in Massachusetts, there's a ballot question arguing, essentially proposing that you could raise the minimum wage up to the same minimum wage for, all the rest of the workers in the economy for tipped workers. There's actually been huge pushback, mostly from servers themselves who are against that. And so I'm kind of curious, I guess this is specifically Massachusetts because it's on the ballot, but it's, as you wrote about, this is an issue in every state. Like what to do about tipped workers in our economy.
Yeah, it's tough because you do have those tip workers who work at like steakhouses or upscale restaurants saying like, I make a ton of money on tips, don't take that away from me. But, that's one share of the people. Then you have the people working at a diner or kind of a lower rent restaurant who might not even make $7 an hour on a slow day. So, from writing that story and hanging out with a bunch of waitresses, I came away thinking you kind of have to raise the wage to make sure that people at least make, a certain amount per hour. Um, and I believe, restaurants can decide that they want to pay more. They can decide that they want to pay hourly. They don't have to do tipped worker. They can say, we're going to pay you $30 an hour or $50 an hour or whatever they want. And so I think it's better to set that floor to make sure that everybody can at least make the minimum wage than it is to kind of allow the upper income people to make a lot of money and kind of leave the lower income tip workers behind.
It's a really interesting perspective. Ricky and I did a whole episode kind of breaking down the mass ballot questions, and one of those we were kind of like, I don't know. It seems like most people in the industry don't want to eh, like increase because it would even if it would raise the floor and lower their ceiling, but it's also interesting to think about who are the people that we're hearing from potentially in advertisements and those sorts of things.
Well, there's a very powerful lobbying group. I think it's called the Restaurant Workers Association or something like that. I don't know if you talk to them,
No,
but
that's super interesting. Yeah.
yeah, they kind of round up the higher wage workers. And, they're the ones who are like, I'm a waiter and I oppose this because I make so much money. It's like, okay, well, you work at a steakhouse where you're serving drinks and you're making a ton of money. That's not every tipped worker. And, they're very effective at lobbying, but that's kind of their whole purpose. So, they don't represent every tipped worker, and it's important to remember that.
Yeah. And we're also in Boston, so like in the city, so there's probably a self-selection bias where tips around here are probably okay, but like you were saying, if you head out to the diners just outside, then all of a sudden it's a different story. I mean, I think that's kind of like a really interesting uh, almost metaphor for all of these issues in terms of what needs to be solved at the federal level versus town or municipality. I guess in some of your reporting on especially in swing states like yeah, what are you hearing about folks are looking toward the president, future president to do for them on the economy?
Yeah, it's tough because the president isn't the Federal Reserve, right? So the president doesn't set interest rates. But one of the things that's been interesting to me is the Biden administration has spent just so much money trying to, jumpstart domestic manufacturing and chip manufacturing and solar panel manufacturing. I mean, if you just look at the amount of money in the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and the stimulus bill, it's just like so much money. And people don't feel that. In a lot of places, like some of these swing states, there was a lot of money spent by the Biden administration. I mean, almost all of them, there was a lot of money spent, some more than others. And they still, you know, it might be too early to tell. Maybe some of these projects are still under construction, but it just goes to show that like you can do the textbook economic stuff as president and just like throw out a lot of money out there and try to do all this stuff, and it might not do anything. It might not help. So it's really hard to kind of know what the next president even could do because, it seems like the Biden administration already did a lot. I think one thing that economists definitely agree on is that tariffs are not the answer, and that they're probably going to make things worse if we put tariffs on a bunch of stuff, a bunch more stuff. It's probably going to make things more expensive. But there was actually an economic study that showed that even if an area benefits from tariffs, like just say they have a manufacturing plant that manufactures something that, competes with China, even if they benefit from tariffs, they think it's because of Republicans, not Democrats. So they're gonna kind of be a fan of Republicans, not Democrats. So I think as a Democratic president, it's very hard to win on the economy.
Yeah, and to that point, that same Gallup poll that you referenced in your article that I mentioned earlier showed that uh, voters trusted Donald Trump 54% to 45% over Kamala Harris in terms of handling the economy, and that's a lead that President Trump maintained throughout, whether it was Biden or Harris, and just seems no matter what the policies are, it's one of his best issues. And kind of to your point, your reporting of the swing states, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin seem to be three of the swing states that have whose economies are better than they are nationally. And you talk about a lot of the reasons is some of like the investment that the Biden administration made, like particularly in Arizona, like there's been so much money from the CHIPS Act that placed in Arizona, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania with some of the domestic manufacturing that the Biden administration has invested in those states. And yet data shows that President Trump is still trusted more on the economy, and Vice President Harris is not, and certainly President Biden is not getting any credit for that. And I can just imagine how frustrating that must be for their campaigns.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's especially interesting in Pennsylvania, where, I think the unemployment rate hasn't been this low since like, I don't know, the 90s or something. Um, or maybe even further back before that. You see that Pennsylvania is this really, really important swing state where, if you win Pennsylvania, you have a good chance of winning the election. And you would think Biden would be really popular there. You have like the Pittsburgh area has a lot of tech manufacturing now, and but it just doesn't seem to be helping Biden for whatever reason.
Do you think it's sort of tied to um, maybe a kind of a perception in swing states like Pennsylvania or Arizona that there are these other factors that impact the economy more so than, something like investment in my state, like whether it be immigration or kind of what you alluded to earlier, just like generally being tough on China.
Yeah, I think immigration could be a big thing there. Even if there's not a ton of immigration in a place like Pennsylvania, I think the perception of it is pretty big. I mean, you're not that close from New York, where there are a lot of migrants coming in. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm not a political reporter, so I'm not quite sure why, this good economic news isn't helping Biden more. But I think there are studies that show that good economic news just helps Republicans more just because of this longstanding idea that Republicans are better on the economy.
That's really interesting. So on the other side of the swing state divide, we had positive news in Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Nevada and Michigan were two states that weren't doing as well. And uh, Nevada's a little bit of an outlier in general in terms of their economy. I think you said almost a quarter of their economy are kind of in the service industry, which is higher than in most other states. And obviously because Vegas is the main driver in terms of city of that economy. But I actually want to talk more about Michigan because you just said you're not a political reporter, fair. But like Nevada looks like it's maybe likely for Trump, and it's a smaller state. But Michigan is critical for Harris, and if President Trump is able to win that one, that could be critical for him too. So can you talk a little bit about what's going on in Michigan and how people are feeling about the economy there?
Yeah, this is something that's been really interesting to me because I remember going to Pennsylvania, these kind of heavy union white collar worker states, like 10 or 15 years ago, and going to these big union rallies, and everyone was rallying for the Democrats. And I think one thing that's going on in Michigan and maybe even Pennsylvania is you have these kind of blue collar working class people who are members of unions and once would have voted for Democrats without even thinking about it, and now are much more attracted to kind of the populism Republican side of things. And so I think, in Michigan, you're having some tough times in the auto industry. You're having Stellantis, which was formerly Chrysler, really struggling to find its footing. And, so much of Michigan and Detroit and just the whole state really is related to the auto industry. So even like its financial services sector is related to the auto industry. So you're seeing them really struggle from that. And I think workers who are affected by that and who might have at one point said, you know what, I'm still going to vote for the Democrat because that's what my union says I should do, are not doing that anymore. And I think that's going to be a really big problem for the Democrats going forward. You saw the Teamsters president addressing the GOP National Convention. He said it was just kind of to do both sides, but that was a big deal kind of in the labor world. Um, and I think, there's been data that just shows that union members are less and less likely to support Democrats. And that's a big win for Republicans, but I think that's going to make it hard for Harris to do well in Michigan.
Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. And then the two states that we haven't mentioned, and you kind of grouped them in the same bucket too, are North Carolina and Georgia, two states that have perhaps slightly higher unemployment rates, but for good reason, in the sense that so many people are moving to those states that there's just businesses cropping up, like don't have enough jobs to find places for all of them. But generally, those states are doing well. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on those two states and how people were feeling about the economy in their states.
Yeah, I think people are feeling pretty good about the economy. I mean, those are both states where a lot of people are moving, so the housing market is pretty tough and it can be really hard to buy a house there. I mean, I think the other thing that's difficult for the Democrats in those states is they're both states that do have a lot of immigration, especially around the cities. And so, you know, that could also cause problems for the Democrats. I mean, I think, especially if you're in the cities in Georgia or North Carolina, things are going to be feeling pretty good, jobs and wages wise. But the housing issue might make people feel like it's not as great as it looks on paper.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then one other thing that you've written about that I wanted to talk about was so much has been made about the Hispanic Latino vote in this election. And obviously, we've known for years that the demographics of the United States have been changing. Like Latinos, the percentage of Latinos in the United States has been rising quite steadily. Uh, but you wrote a piece. It was about Isabel Casillas Guzman, who is the administrator of the Small Business Administration since in the Biden administration, and one of the parts of that piece that stood out to me was you wrote that even though that the Latino population has been changing for years and decades, we haven't seen a corresponding increase in Latino-owned businesses until now. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what she has been doing over these last 3+ years as the head of the Small Business Association Administration? And then that's my first question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So she's been trying to back more. I mean, she doesn't have that much power. Like the SBA doesn't give out loans itself, but she's been trying to back or ensure that more SBA backed loans go to minorities like Latino owned businesses, Black owned businesses, women owned businesses. Because it's such a growing part of the US population, she says, those types of people are historically underserved and have really struggled to get capital. And she hears from them that they need more money to get things started. And I think that's made a difference. You have a lot of small businesses being started now. That often happens during a recession or when people get laid off, they kind of start their own businesses. But I think she has tried to really make sure that the money that the government backs goes to people that it hasn't usually gone to.
And then my follow-up question to that is one of the aspects politically that we've seen is that President Trump has been making inroads in Latino voters in a way that Republicans traditionally haven't, particularly among like young Latino men. Uh, and that's a kind of marrying those two situations with an administration that has seemingly tried to invest specifically in underserved communities with the sense that these these underserved communities are changing their traditional like voting patterns and party affiliations.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question?
It's another like how do we marry those two situations, like both of these things being
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, it just feels like the Democrats can't catch a break, right? Um, yeah, I mean, I think uh, Latinos definitely vote on social issues. And, Democrats have been pretty vocal, especially this cycle on abortion. And I think that might turn some Latino voters off. Um, and so, I think the social issues help Democrats appeal to a lot of young people and more diverse crowd than Republicans. But maybe that causes some problems with Latino voters.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. So Alana, like what will you be watching for? Again, understanding you're not a political reporter, but you've done so much reporting and investigation and days out there in the field looking at these issues. So whether it's exit polls or different states, how they kind of break down, what are some of the things you'll be looking for on election night?
Yeah, I guess turnout's a big one. That to traditionally skews towards Democrats, and um, I think I saw the wet like it hasn't rained on the East Coast forever, and now it looks like it's supposed to rain on election day, I think. Um, Maybe not, but so yeah, turnout. And I think you can't really trust the polls right now. Um, the polls didn't think Trump was going to win in 2016, and I think, people are maybe still a little embarrassed, like undecided voters are maybe embarrassed that they're to vote for him, so they're not going to tell pollsters. So I don't know if I would believe exit polls, but I don't know. I think it's going to be hard for the Democrats to pull it off, just because of kind of all the issues that we've talked about. But Michigan, Pennsylvania, those are some pretty important places to keep watching.
And maybe one final like parting thought from you. I think over the course of this conversation, one thing that keeps coming to the forefront of my mind is that it just feels difficult to understand what is the current state of the economy. So if you're sort of thinking about it, both from a perception, from the conversations that you've had and the reporting that you've done, but also from the data, like how would you sum up where the economy is at today?
Yeah, I would say the economy is very strong. Unemployment is pretty low and consumers are spending a ton of money. That's really propelling the economy. So it's kind of weird when consumers say like, vibe session or whatever, and then they go out and spend all this money. So, I would say it's in a pretty good shape and it's in pretty good shape, and that is unfortunately making some stuff more expensive, like houses. Um, but overall, I think the economy is in a very good place. Even though there was a jobs report today that was not very good, that was just because of the hurricanes. And I think, if you had to give the economy a grade, probably like a B plus, A minus. It's pretty good.
Well, in a big picture perspective, no matter kind of who wins the election, that's generally a good thing. Like I think I read that this is the first, really three of the last four newcomers to the White House came in uh, during a difficult economic time. Like George W. Bush came in during like the dot-com bubble, and then President Obama came in under the Great Recession. President Biden comes in under the pandemic and sky high inflation, and so whoever it is in January, they're inheriting an economy that, knock on wood, is in pretty good shape. Which again is, as a country, that's some good news, I guess. So, yeah,
Right. Yeah. Or at least it will be in good shape for a little while. We'll see after that.
that's totally fair. We will see. All right, Alana, we've referenced a number of articles that you have written what recently. If people wanted to follow up more on those articles in particular, or like your work in general, where could they go and find that?
Yeah, they can go to time.com, or just Google me. I also have a website. It's just alanasemuels.com that showcases some of my favorite stories.
Highly recommend the website. It was Ricky and I, in just doing preparation for this interview, obviously clicked around on a lot of them, and I ended up down rabbit holes. I was like, and I learned a lot. So I appreciate your reporting. We appreciate your time today, so tight to the election. And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on both what happens next week, but also your work in the future. So thank you, Alana. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, good talking to you.
Again, huge thanks to Alana for her time and her expertise. So much of her reporting is like on the ground doing the work, and so I think it's really valuable to talk to someone like that, really ever, but particularly in a time right before the election when we're trying to get a sense of some of these things. Ricky, she took pains to make it clear that she's not a political reporter, but one of the main themes to me I kept coming back to is this idea that like Republican messaging on the economy is good and isn't just something that has been good the last 6 months or these last 2 years. It's something that took years and decades of campaigning to drive this message home. It reminded me a little bit of when we talked to the San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin like last year, and he was saying it didn't seem to matter what we did on crime. Republicans, their message, people just trust Republicans more on crime. And he was kind of like, I hate it from his perspective, but he was like, you got to kind of tip the cap to them. And that was one of my main takeaways is, as she said at the end, the economy is in really good shape, better shape than it has been in for a long time. And yet people trust Donald Trump more on it.
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of a common theme, and if you will, like one challenge that democracies face, which is this misunderstanding of cause and effect, and like how do I divorce what I intuitively understand from like what is actually happening, right? Like easy story on immigration is, immigrants come in, they drain all our services, they're doing all these things, and it's obviously hurting the economy. So, I'm for the party that's going to deal with that. If you actually look at a lot of data and statistics around how immigration impacts economies, it's like a very different story. But intuitively, I understand one and I don't understand the other. So I'm gonna go with what I feel like I understand. And we've had multiple discussions about this over the course of the years around kind of the echo chambers and how they work. But I think one of those like the confirmation bias, and if I think that this is how it's working and someone tells me that what I think is right, regardless of whether or not it is right, I'm all of a sudden on board with how they're describing the situation. And so when it comes to uh, how we deal with jobs going overseas, right? Like under the Trump administration, you didn't have any of those really any meaningful amount of those jobs repatriated to the US because the economics just like aren't there. But you had some guy come up and like talk very forcefully about it. And so the perception issue is one that Democrats are continuingly on these types of issues going to fight an uphill battle. And credit to Republicans, I don't really think that they even have to deal too much with like reality, as it were, because as she said, right, like wages are increasing. There's all sorts of things that are doing very well, but you have this very stubborn issue of the housing market not being affordable, and that just permeates and childcare and other things like that kind of just permeates people's sense of, well, I have money in my pocket, but I can't buy, these couple very important things. And so my feeling is that everything is bad.
And those are real feelings, right? Like it's
Totally, totally.
right, and that's why it's easy to kind of say at the end, like, oh, the economy is doing really well, and like we pointed to off the top, like the stock market's great and unemployment is down, but you're not feeling that if you are unemployed, if you're in Nevada and a quarter of the jobs are service jobs, and they just haven't come back in the same way, or if you're in Arizona, to your point, you're making more money, but because so many people are moving into the Phoenix metro area, you can't afford a house, and so that's where again, I think it's important. The top line is, oh, the economy is doing well, but the reality on the ground is, and Alana mentioned this too, of like groceries are expensive, and so we're talking about like she brought out tip workers, right? If you're only making 2.13 an hour at in a rural diner, and like your employer is not following the law and rate and paying you up to minimum wage, then you have to go home and buy food for your family. Like the economy is not good for you, and so I do think that was a really important point that she brought up. Is just because the economy seems like the numbers seem to be good with the economy doesn't mean people are actually feeling that. And so there is some kind of like perception versus reality divide that Republican messaging has done a good job and Democratic messaging hasn't done a good job. But I also think there's some tone deafness from either from us or from some political people being like, but the economy's so good. And it's like, it's not good for a lot of people out there, or people don't feel that.
No, and that's entirely fair. Like, I mean, I think that the tricky part is, right? Like a lot of Democratic messaging that feels tone deaf. Oh, stock market S&P is at its highest. Like Trump was banging that drum throughout 2017, 18, 19,
Yeah.
right? S&P's never been higher than since I've been president. And it's like, okay, I don't know significantly how Republican messaging on the economy is that much better or different, but I really think it's that these like other issues around immigration and around kind of, yeah, are we exporting our jobs to China? Are we like promoting free trade or whatever, making it more difficult for companies to go elsewhere for their labor force? And I think maybe the other piece that strikes me is that traditionally the economy being good or bad has meant, can people get a job? And now with unemployment sub 4%, it's not that. There is this like notion that, and as you were saying, people may have a job, but it doesn't fulfill them in the same way, and it doesn't allow them to buy the things that they, immediately feel like, okay, I have a respectable job. I'm making a wage that I had always felt like if I get to this level, I can then buy the things that other people have that I see, right? Like a house or whatnot. And that dream is becoming unattainable. And so you're absolutely right. Why I've sort of touched on this perception and reality. I think that is very real for people when it's like I physically cannot, there are no homes for me to buy, and the ones that are out there are exorbitantly expensive and not for me. And that's an issue for the economy, but is it really, right? Like this, I think that's kind of the challenge.
Well, that was a huge part of what I was thinking when Alana was speaking is like the economy is so many different facets, and you asked a good question, and like what could any president do, right? And her response was, well, like none of them is going to be in charge of like the Federal Reserve, so like you're not going to really be able to impact interest rates as much as Trump might try to in some ways, like this is. We always say this, right? And we said it off the top, like the economy is the most important issue for people. It's the economy, stupid, right? But the president has very little impact on the economy. There are all of these other like market forces that exist in terms of housing and immigration and tip wages, right? Like they're all the economy is just it's a name that we slap on something that has a million different factors to it. And so it's very hard to summarize again, like how the economy is doing or what effect the president will have on the economy. I guess last thought for me on this, Ricky, is I don't necessarily trust Vice President Harris on the economy. Like she's got this, nice phrase of we're going to have an opportunity economy, which sounds great. What does that mean? I don't know. Like some of the specific ideas she floated are like banning price gouging or some like the, housing affordability stuff, I think are actually bad policy. So I don't necessarily be like, oh, I think Kamala is going to be great for the economy. With that said, as Alana mentioned, President Trump, one of his main economic policies is to slap massive tariffs on almost everything and everyone. And I know for a fact that that stuff does not work. So while I don't trust that Kamala is going to make the economy better, I'm pretty sure that Donald's going to make the economy worse.
Yeah, I nothing to significantly add there, and it's continues to be just a sore spot for both of us that we didn't have really meaningful discussions around the differences in policy, so we could make an informed decision because of all the kind of theatrics around the personality of one of the candidates. So and because that very conveniently became the focal point of the other candidacy is that like we don't actually hear about what are the pros and cons of these different solutions. I mean, beyond just the tariffs, I think Donald Trump and even Kamala Harris to an extent have just been running around being like, and we're not going to tax tips and we're not going to tax this and you're going to get a credit for that. And it's like, just the Oprah Winfrey show. Everyone's getting a free car, I think, or something.
Well, I love that. I was going to make that same analogy, but I knew you had it. All right, that's all I have on the economy, Ricky. It's been, we started this podcast 4 years ago, right? In the run up to the 2020 election. And in some ways, like we were right in the throes of it. And it's kind of wild that in some ways we've always been kind of leading here. Like we're for our journey. So much of these last 4 years has been analyzing, the fallout from the 2020 election, what's going on under the Biden administration, the lead up to this election, and now we're finally here. I think, as Steve Kornacki said when we talked to him a month ago, as Alana mentioned here, the wins are difficult for Democrats. I think that, quite honestly, this is the best President Trump has looked in his three bids to me, poll wise, right? Like no one thought he was going to win in 16. It looked like he was going to get blown out in 2020. This is the first time where like he's even or close to even. A lot of polls nationally in swing states. Alana brought up the point that, and Steve did too, right? That the polls have been wrong before in underestimating Trump voters. I do think there's a belief out there that there's a certain segment of traditional Republicans or disaffected Republicans or independents who are maybe not telling the pollsters that they're voting for Kamala Harris because they're embarrassed to say that they're going to vote for a Democrat. But there might be some polling might be missing those people too. Who knows? Obviously, no one knows how it's going to turn out. It'll certainly be fascinating to watch. I'm sure you and I will be texting each other late into the night on Tuesday, but
Oh, no, not me. I'm going to
uh,
bed.
yeah. I was gonna say I'll be texting other people. You'll wake up to a million messages from me that you can scroll through and get all upset when you wake up early in the morning.
That's right. Yeah, no. I learned my lesson after 2016 that it doesn't do anything good for me, just raise my blood pressure and nope, not doing that again.
All right, well, that's it. I mean, it will, like I said, certainly be fascinating. We'll be back post-election once we seem to have results. Uh, I don't know when that's going to be, but we'll be here to talk about it and break it all down. But again, thanks to Alana for her time and perspective, and thanks to everyone that listens. I hope everyone has a safe election day and everyone's able to go out and vote and make your voice heard.
Yeah, cheers to that. So we leave it here.
See you, buddy.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.